So before we deep dive into today's topic, I'd like to quickly introduce our organization, Climate and Sustainability Initiative, which is a dedicated research organization with a mission to provide stakeholders with the necessary tools and knowledge to inform decision making and driving sustainable investments through meticulous research, strategic consultations, and targeted support. The webinar is part of our ongoing series aimed at fostering informed dialogue and setting ambitious yet achievable goals for a low carbon future. Now, coming to the objective of the webinar, it aims to explore critical focus areas for the forthcoming budget and other policy support that can propel the nation towards the ambitious goal for 2047. India's net zero goal of 2070 provides the biggest infrastructure development opportunity of our lifetime. Today's discussion will focus on how the new government can pave way towards these objectives. We will delve into these key policy areas and solutions that can foster Viksit Bharat, that is, develop India, and address the pressing challenges of climate change and energy security. On that note, it's time for a quick surprise test for all the attendees. Can we have the poll question here, please, Sanchi? All right. So let us see if all are here, and they might have heard these numbers somewhere or the others. Let's see the pulse of the audience. You have 20 seconds to answer this question. For those who have just joined, I'd like to mention that the meeting is being recorded, and if you have any questions during the webinar, you can type it in the Q&A box. We will try to answer as many as possible towards the end. If the panelists would like to take up any of the questions in between, it's completely up to them, but we'll accumulate and take the questions. All right, so the time is up, and let's see. Okay, great. Great to see that 63% of the audience, they are all well informed, well read, and they know that the 10.1 trillion is the estimated investment opportunity for the net zero goal of 2070. All right, so let's move on. Let's move on to the main agenda of this webinar, and I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel for today. Please give a warm welcome to our panelists. Our first panelist is Mr. Chintan Shah. With over 30 years of expertise in research and advancements in project development, Chintan Shah is a well-known leader in India's renewable energy industry. He is currently the group president of Renew, one of the top power companies committed to leading the clean energy transition in India and beyond. Joining us next is Mr. Lavanya Jena, who is the head of the Climate Policy Initiative Center for Sustainable Finance, where he champions innovative approaches to climate action. He brings a potent blend of experience and knowledge on climate finance to the table. Our third panelist is Ms. Preeti Agarwal, Senior Director at Care Ratings, India's second largest rating agency. Having worked in the financial services sector for more than 20 years, she has a strong track record of leadership and a wide range of skills in credit rating operations. As national head, he currently oversees the MCG team for the East, North, and Tamil Nadu and South. Lastly, we have Ms. Suranjali Tandon, who is an associate professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, where she oversees research on sustainable finance and direct access. He is a visiting research fellow at Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment at London School of Economics. And finally, we have Mr. Vaibhav Pratap Singh, who is the Executive Director at CSI, as our moderator for today's discussion. So thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Vaibhav to lead the discussion. Vaibhav, over to you.
So, thanks, Nusrat. So welcome all and good afternoon to all. And maybe we can dive directly into the main section of the webinar, that is the panel discussion with all four panelists over here. And maybe I can straightly go into the questions to the Akshay Urja Evam Vitt Visheshagya over here, Mr. Shah. So since we all know that the renewable energy sector provides the biggest of the opportunities in India for India to be net zero by 2070, And there has already been a development. So I will frame the question into two parts. So what India story stands today. So where do you see how the government budget, policies, incentives have really helped the renewable energy sector become a hub for international investments, especially in a scenario where you see many large scale investors or patient capital like pension funds who are moving away from these long-term bonds globally, but are still interested in the Indian story and are taking exposure on the equity side. So what India has done right. So maybe if you can focus on that. And the secondly, the next part is since the pace of RE deployment in the country is still not at par with the 30 trend lines. So what are the bottlenecks in your view? So maybe if you can focus on these two aspects, and over to you, Mr. Shah.
Yeah, thanks, Vaibhav, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me for this roundtable webinar. Uh, as far as India is concerned, there's a particular theory in any business which is known as replicability, scalability, and sustainability. Now, these three things are very important for any business to grow. And India has got it right because the type of projects that are coming up, be it wind or solar, uh, we have made it replicable. We make it scalable also, and it's sustainable also in terms of its IRR. That's what is been driving this thing. So essentially, what India has done is very simple. We had central bidding guidelines got created. You've got four REIs who are keeping on auctioning capacities on a yearly basis. Last year it was almost like close to 54 gigawatt, and they're able to get into a power purchase agreement with the distribution companies. We have the ISTS waiver, and you're dealing with CTU, which essentially is a much large body in terms of its execution capability. So you get the transmission connectivity. Uh, Land has been always a challenge in India, but we've been seeing it that's getting resolved also at various quarters and all. Essentially, in case of solar, it's much easier because you have huge amount of land in Rajasthan and Gujarat, which is essentially get deployed for solar part in the central bits. So what I'm trying to tell you over here, Vaibhav, is that we got one thing pretty right, which is you have the REIs getting into bidding, which is practically AAA rated entities. There is no payment issues there. You have large players entering this particular field who are executing these projects, having experience and all. They able to raise equity as well as raise debt. Recently, as I know, one of the nationalized bank has started offering 8.5% rate of interest to RE projects, provided three conditions are met. PPAs are in place, land is in place, connectivity is in place, the contracts are in place, and also the equity is in place, and you have a fair amount of experience in setting up these projects. What I'm trying to tell you over here is 8.5% rate of interest is like closer to housing finance. That means the bankers don't perceive a risk in these projects. So that's the type of environment we are working on right now. And now, what was an average ticket size of 50 megawatt per project in 2012-13, it became 250 megawatt roughly over the next 5-7 years. And now we are seeing it 500 megawatt is a norm for newer projects coming up. So you made it scalable. You also replicated the entire thing, and it's still sustainable. Now, this particular growth path, if it's likely to continue, we don't foresee any problem in getting equities and debt and execution in place for the as far as India is concerned. But having said so, we have seen certain changes in terms of bid constructs, where essentially we had started from plain vanilla solar and wind to go to a hybrid model, to an RTC model, to an FDRE model. So bids are getting little bit more complex. Outside, not complex. It is essentially to look at the load pattern that India has got. And electricity, as you know, cannot be stored. You have to consume electricity as and when at the right time. And so that's the reason this bid construct is important. And it's an evolving science, I would say. In future, we'll also see fair amount of projects coming up, setting up for green hydrogen facilities. So that's going to again pose a different set of challenge. But I think that the amount of maturity that we have in India right now, I think will resolve this issue. Having said that, what challenges you're saying will be there in the future? Uh, Challenges obviously is going to be infra, essentially land and infra. which is a challenge today also. But we're seeing that these challenges are getting resolved because the entire system across India is working towards creating this infrastructure in place, essentially transmission. And as we move forward, I think this will be resolved. As far as 2030 targets are concerned, I think we should not look at just 2030. What is important is we have a target of 500 gigawatt. It may get over in 2031, maybe 32, or maybe 2029 also. It really doesn't matter. Path is very clear. Rather, nowadays, people have been started talking about 1 terawatt targets because you have to go beyond 500 gigawatt. What happens after 2032? Obviously, your path is going to continue. If you want to go towards carbon neutrality, maybe one of the aspiration would be, to if you're reaching 500 gigawatt by 2030, why can't we look at 1 terawatt by 2035? Something, an aspiration that we should be now looking for the future, and we have to think accordingly. As far as your second part of the question is concerned, I think equity is a non-issue today because the India story as it is depicted at a global level for deployment of capital is an accepted story. The question today pertains today is about the cost of this equity. As you know, the US Fed rate is all-time high, and the cost of equity is in a way reflects from the US Fed rate. So that's the challenge at this juncture, where essentially we see that US Fed rate getting a little bit softened in the coming period, and then will flow of global equity will again kickstart in the renewable sector, because that's something which is very important. Lower the cost of the equity, the hurdle rate, lower the tariff, and more acceptability is the electricity rate by the distribution companies. We yet to see pension funds and insurance funds getting into debt market. We've seen that in the equity markets. So I think that is something which is again important, that we need to create a robust environment in India for creating bonds, asset-backed bonds, which is in a way not there today. That's where I think there's a great relation of a renewable energy project which can run for 25 years, having like an annuity income. And a project normally runs after 3 years, get a rating of A and AAA. Ideally suited for a debt fund or for a pension fund or insurance fund to take a position on the debt side. And that is something that we need to evolve, because even to reach 2030, we're looking at raising a 23 lakh crores of debt capital. Now that cannot be come from a term lending. It has to go to the bond market. And that is where I would say that focus should be now for the next couple of years, to deepen the bond market and create a bond market which has got a longer size. I mean, to say a longer amortization schedule from a 5-year tenure to a 10-year or 12-year tenure, maybe larger. I think that's a bit from my side.
Thanks, Mr. Shah. So maybe I will now move on to a different sector, automobile. But before I move to Preeti, I would also like, if you would like to add to this, uh, your demands for as a credit rating provider. Anything if you would like to add to this, or either maybe we can just directly deep dive into the automobile sector. Any comments as to what as a rating
So
provider
I
you
would
feel?
agree with the views of Mr. Shah totally, that market really needs to deepen if we really want to achieve the target of zero emissions, so that adequate funds are invested in the sector.
You got a thumbs up, Chintan, from Preeti around bonds are the requirements. So moving into the automobile sector, which contributes already 7% of India's GDP and is an important part if you want to become a Viksit Desh by 2047. And the biggest news story in this is the EVs. We have an automobile market of somewhere around 24 million automobiles are sold every year, primarily two-wheelers, and four-wheelers are, in terms of market value, are also on the larger side. So if I can similarly ask you about what India has done right over here, where we have seeing more than a million units being sold both in FY23 and FY24, and what has been the role of these schemes that came up, the FAME 1, 2, their current successor, the low GST, state incentives. And second part of the question is, beyond the incentives, how do you foresee the market evolving over the next 5 years? Primarily because most of the EV players are in quite dark red today. So how they will evolve, how the market should evolve, how the next phase of growth could look like. Over to you, Preeti.
So if we see actually, though we have seen a robust increase in the EV sales in the past 2 years, but approximately 93 to 95% of this sales have come from two-wheeler segment or three-wheeler segments. So EV penetration in passenger vehicle continues to be at nascent stage, and faster adoption of the same would be kind of the key prospect of EV industry if actually we want a success towards that. FAME scheme, especially the FAME 2, along with various state government incentives and road tax exemptions, actually help bridge the price gap between this ICE and electric two-wheelers that had led to higher penetration of two-wheelers, about 5 to 6% presently. So the reason being the cost of ownership of electric two-wheeler is presently favorable, and that actually should drive the demand for the same. But on the other side, when we see despite subsidy benefits, the lifetime ownership cost of an electric vehicle is still not comparable with that of ICE vehicles or CNG vehicles in passenger car segments. And that's why we see that the penetration currently is pretty low in this segment, 1 to 2% presently. And this, along with other challenges such as range anxiety, lack of adequate charging infrastructure, and undeveloped resale market. All these are kind of negatives which or concerns which really needs to be addressed to. And that is the reason this has led to higher demand for alternate fuel vehicles such as CNG and hybrid vehicles in the passenger vehicle segment, which is likely to sustain in the medium term, keeping the penetration of electric vehicle passenger cars being low. So as the FAME 2 scheme has ended on 31st March 24, what we expect is announcement of FAME 3 shall be crucial to sustain and further increase the demand of electric vehicles, especially electric two-wheelers. And in next 5 years, if we speak as the charging infrastructure improves and battery prices decrease, we expect electric vehicle penetration in three-wheeler to be highest at approx 45 to 50%, followed by two-wheelers, electric two-wheelers at 25 to 30%. But passenger vehicles we still expect would be 12 to 15%, and lowest in commercial vehicles is what we expect.
So thanks, Preeti. So there were a lot of facts and figures around that EVs are doing well, but a lot needs to be done if we are to
That's
go
true.
beyond the current penetration levels. So now we heard about the EVs or the automobile sector as a whole, and we heard about the renewable energy sector. Let me turn to the economist in the house, and so to invite Professor Tandon over here into the mix as an economist who brings in a diverse field of research that includes research around exports as well as into other fields. And if India is to become a Viksit Desh, just going by hard numbers, India today sits at around USD 8,200 GDP per capita. And many economists believe that if we are to go beyond, become a Viksit Desh or I would say, a developed country, other than HDI being greater than zero point 0.8, you need to have income levels of 12,000 to 15,000 on the lower side. And some economists say $30,000 of GDP per capita needs to be there. So, and exports, if China plus one is the policy, how can India really be a part of this export cycles? And what could be the impact of these measures like CBAM, which are being put on by Europe, or other incentives that are coming across the globe? So let's say IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, EU is trying its own Green Deal. So let me hand it over to Professor Tandon over here to understand what she sees. Is exports possible, not possible? Are these real threats, not, or just we can move ahead with the business as usual? So over to you, Ms. Tandon.
Thank you so much, Vaibhav. I will try and do justice to your question by giving an answer which, in a sense, gives a direction of where we're headed. The last 2 years have been particularly interesting because the world is seeming to retract into its shell. A lot of countries are looking within, and you just mentioned the IRA, and the EU's Green Deal is a symptom of that countries are looking inwards. You've seen even countries like India sort of focus on domestic policy. But having said that, when we imagine higher levels of growth and higher levels of income, there is obviously interconnection with the world, exports today, say exports of goods and services today, are a large part of India's gross value add. So about a fifth sort of comes from exports. I would imagine that if India wants to move to a higher growth path, it would have to continue to look at markets outside itself to grow. But then there needs to be a vision which is to be followed through with a plan on where we want to focus. So over the last few years, if you look at products that have dominated India's merchandise trade, have been engineering goods and electronic goods, which I think is a great thumbs up for even transition, because you would have certain products which would be in the technology space, which India can hope to sort of manufacture and export. The other thing is that exports of services have been quite fast, rapidly growing for India. So again, within that you have software services, which I think would be resilient even if we see a difference in transition pace across countries. So you see some kind of resilience where there is focus on digitization and growth, and you also see some compatibility with transition goals across the world, where we tend to focus on high-end products, which are sort of technology-driven. But having said that, there are, of course, challenges. If there are countries like the EU, which tend to dominate our, export basket of products like iron and steel and aluminium, which would be covered under the CBAM, then obviously there will be effects on these industries backward to the Indian economy. Within this, again, I want to sort of quickly mention that we shouldn't look at the Indian industry or exporters as a monolith. They're not all the same size. You have large companies, which if you look at, the EU's reporting, there are large companies from India in the iron and steel sector, which are already present there, already compatible with, in some ways, of the pricing mechanisms that exist there. And you have the small and medium enterprises, which today are a large part of India's GVA. Again, the MSME contributes close to 40% of the GVA. Within this would be some companies which are operating, in the affected sectors, and so therefore you would have backward impact on output and employment. So I think what is essential as India looks at its own trade policy is to negotiate with countries as they begin to look at. There are other countries that are also looking at the border adjustment taxes. So India should begin to negotiate. It can do that through its own internal strategies on pricing as well as incentives. I won't focus on that right now, but just to say that there is potential for growth through exports, remaining cognizant of the fact that we must move up in the value chain of goods that we export, focus on services, and as well remain aware of the fact that there will be costs that will be flowing backwards to India through investment incentives that are being offered in countries like the US, where you see penetration of EV manufacturing, for example, or renewable manufacturing in specific zones that are being given subsidies and tax credits, and you will also see costs to trade being introduced by jurisdictions in. Thank you.
So what I hear here is that you said, yes, we can do it, but there are lots of caveats out there. So maybe let's plan better. Let's look at the sectors out there, and let's look at our strengths, how we can do it, how we can manage it. And substantially, we can go above the $350 per capita of exports that we are today, and just go up the value chain, and we can do it. And by 2047, we can be a Viksit Desh, not just based on exports, but also other factors. So now maybe I can turn to Mr. Jana over here and ask him around how to finance the entire transition. So we heard about automobiles, we heard about exports, we heard about RE. So they all require a lot of infrastructure to be built out there. And Mr. Jaina represents a company which provides data around finance trends, both globally and locally, sustainable finance trend. And he also, I would say, is more of a teacher or a trainer to the bankers around ESG. So over to you around the topic as to how India could really finance this opportunity. Until now, we are doing it locally through banks, local banks. Are there other avenues that are possible out there? So how would you really finance the audience called up a number $10.1 trillion out there? So how we can finance these? So is there a way we can go beyond the banks, non-banks? Chintan said bonds is the way forward. So how do you feel about all these things? Over to you, Mr. Jena.
Thanks, Baba. Nice to hear from Chintan, Preeti, and Suranjali. Okay, 10.1 trillion or 12 trillion, it's a big, massive number. If I divide it by 40, it will be $200 billion per annum. I think total corporate capital expenditure in 2022 was 130 billion dollar. So we don't have so much money actually, but definitely we can see that our GDP economy will grow over a period of time, maybe for the next 20 years, 5.5%. Okay, and we have a financial savings close to 30%. We can understand that last year financial savings rate in the country declined to I think 18 to 19% or 20 to 23%, which is very small. But at the same time, we need to see that how the money is channelized in the country. If we look at only financial savings, it will be around 14%. It may increase to 16% or so, which is channelized through commercial banks, pension fund, insurance companies, as well as mutual funds. And like Chintan said, and most of the financing for the renewable energy sector, I'm talking about the debt financing, it's coming from the commercial banks and NBFCs. And commercial banks are not really designed to provide long-term financing. Many times, various committees have said, okay, commercial banks should not have too much exposure to long-term financing, particularly infrastructure sector. Currently, if we see commercial banks exposure to power sector, it could be 5 to 6% in total. Okay, it includes power generation, distribution, and transmission. So we cannot expect that the commercial banks will increase their exposure to the power sector significantly. And definitely after a few years, you will see that, okay, there is not enough, I will say, availability in the balance sheet to increase more financing for the renewable energy sector. At the same time, we are heavily relying on non-banking financial companies like PFC, REC, these kind of institutions who are also providing heavy debt financing. Debt financing around 25% of total NBFC exposure is to the power sector only. Out of that, maybe 10% to renewable energy sector. At the same time, we need to understand that some of the public sector finance corporation are more or less backed by the government, okay, because the bondholders of these companies are backed by the government. So it's easy for the bondholders to buy these bonds because the rating is very high. But we cannot expect that when the NBFC become very large, there is a possibility that NBFC may not increase their exposure to the power sector, particularly the private NBFCs. They are continuously, their exposure to retail lending is increasing at a massive rate. So it means that we need to move away from commercial banks and NBFCs to pension fund and insurance companies, because these two institutional investors, their liability duration is very long, and they are low risk seeking, I'll say, kind of investors. And it is possible to tap these two kind of investors to fund the long-term debt financing needs of renewable energy sector, which Chintan mentioned. Because if you rely on, let's say, 5 to 7 years, every 5 to 7 years you are going to refinance, there is a refinancing risk. Particularly if you are refinancing and the interest rate is very high, it is definitely a risk for the renewable energy sector. But the issue is that, like Preeti and Chintan will agree, that what is the credit rating? Okay, although we can see that most of the renewable energy sector credit rating is AA, but is it enough actually for institutional investors? The answer is no. Okay, if we see LIC's total portfolio, I think 75% of LIC portfolio is allocated to government securities, 20% is equities. Okay, maybe 2 to 3% is government bonds, corporate bonds. There is nothing in the insurance company portfolio exposure to corporate bonds. And unfortunately, here in India, most of the corporate bonds are issued by banks and unbanking financial companies, not the real economies. The companies which are operating in the real economies, including the utility sector. Number two is that most of the corporate bonds are issued, the duration could be 3 to 5 years, not 10 to 15 years or 20 years, which the renewable energy sector really needs to avoid the refinancing risk, which is necessary. The question is that how can you do that? Okay, unless you improve your rating to AA, more than AA, or this is definitely AAA. So there is no way to tap capital from pension fund and insurance companies. That's number one. Number two is that we need to depend the bond market so that the renewable energy sector, they can issue very, very long-term debt, for example, 15 to 20 years to avoid the refinancing risk. So this needs to be addressed. Secondly, there are, people keep on talking about alternative finance instrument or innovative finance instruments, for example, green bond. I don't think that green bonds has been a darling now because the green premium is gone actually. So it is not giving any benefits to borrower and investors also. They are not giving any premium to the green bond issuer. It means that there is no incentive for the borrowers except a PR exercise to issue green bonds in the capital market. The question is that if at any point of time the institutional investors or the capital market, they realize that okay, there is a massive transition risk associated with other power sector, I will say carbon intensive power sector, there is a possibility that they may prefer the bonds issued by renewable energy sector, not by thermal power plant. But if I see India's current stand on coal or thermal power plant, I don't think that's going to be possible in next decade or so. Okay, my second point will be the industrial sector, which we call the hard to decarbonize industries. Okay, which also need capital, and by design, because they hold the kind of asset which can survive maybe 40 years, 30 years, or 50 years also. For example, steel industry, they can survive for 50 years, shipping 20 years, airlines 30 to 40 years. Okay, so here you need a different kind of capital. Okay, people keep on talking about transition financing or sustainability linked bond, although there is a lot of questions people ask whether this transition financing is really helping in climate actions or it is some form of greenwashing or so. But unfortunately here in India, some of the companies have really issued sustainability linked bonds, but the question is that duration of the bond is only 5 to 7 years. Okay, 5 to 7 years issuance of bonds are not going to help the hard to decarbonize industries, because when you are investing in a technology and you will get the benefits of the technology, here I'm talking about the financial benefits over a very, very long period of time, because currently you are not paying the carbon price which is desired by not by the market, by the real economy, I will say, if I take into account all the negative externalities. So it means that there is no incentive for any company to invest in low carbon technologies. But if they issue very, very long-term capital, there is a possibility that they can derive financial benefits once the regulation become very, very stringent or carbon pricing becomes very, very high in the future. There is a possibility. So you can say it is a transition bonds, or you can say it deep discount bond. Definitely, you can add a lot of covenants to this kind of bonds so that there will be no hanky-panky by the borrowers. It is very, very critical. Okay, I'll stop here and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
So before I move back to Chintan, so there are a few questions there which are there in the Q&A. If you would like to answer any of these, maybe you can take in your comments, or maybe you can just answer them live and we can take it later as well. And you mentioned, so to summarize your points, Mr. Jaina out there. So you mentioned something that the saving rates are falling down. So I would like Chintan to come in. It reminds me of my first conversation with him, where he said that the how economy is moving and saving rates are falling down, and what are the reasons on it. So before I move into that question of part of it, but you summarized that a lot of danda is required, that if you want to make sure that the economy where the infrastructure needs to be built up, the money flows into it. So LIC and all other avenues need to be explored if is possible, and a lot of other, including bond market and how to go about it, and including just you can't rely on a single banking system where banks and BFCs could be the main source of capital as had been in past. So over to you, Chintan, if you want to explore the lower saving rates, and then I can move into the main question for you.
So lower saving rate is always good for the sector, but it's not great for the economy, because the reason of the lower saving rate is more important. What is happening is people have started realizing it's better to get into a quasi money market than straight away getting into a CASA market, which bulk of the banks operate. So a very funny situation in the last 1 year where the credit growth is going up by all lenders. That means there's a huge demand for loans. At the same time, the CASA is going down. First time it is happening in India. And the reason is very simple. I'm quite sure whoever is in this audience right now, I'm quite sure you have at least one SIP in place. Everybody has got. I can see the smile, Vaibhav. That means you also got an SIP in place. Everybody has an SIP in place. So what is happening is slowly people are moving their money to the money markets. And when you got an SIP or a mutual fund market, you are essentially taking different type of exposure. One can a pure equity exposure, one is a mixed bag, or can be a pure debt. So people have realized it that every rate does not yield you much. It's a 7% rate of interest, and that is also taxable. So net you get is like 5%, 5.5%. So people have realized it because now we have an option available. The good part is the money is moving to the money market on one side. What is important is we need to now dovetail this money lying in the money market to the right sector. What is happening? Bulk of this money is getting utilized for call money or for NFOs, NCD subscription, as well as equity markets. Now that's the time that we have liquidity in the market. As you also know, against all odds, the stock market is doing great because there's huge liquidity in the market. That's the whole idea. It's important to push this liquidity in the right manner, right jagah pe. Now that's again, renewables give that stability. Now, if somebody is looking at a debt investment, I would say renewables is a great place because you have a stable revenue. I agree with Labania that rating is very important for anybody to get into it. But I think most of the RE projects can definitely get AA rating. Now, what you require is a credit enhancement to one notch more. That is what is needed to be created in the market today. But essentially, government should come out with credit enhancement instruments for the likely projects of AA, so that they can climb to AAA and make it essentially attractive for the bond markets to get money absorbed in those projects. That's something that we need to work upon. And this makes a great sense because, for example, EPF is struggling to give 8.5% return. We all know this. Well, I can 100% sure if it's an renewable project with a triple rating, you can easily get a 9% yield without any fail. So you have an opportunity in India, and this needs to be tapped. It's a matter of time. It will be realized in a couple of years that this has to be done anyway. The entire global market is doing it. It's just that we have not experimented this in India, and it's very important again to get this insurance money and the pension money to get into this particular market space. Not because it is good for them, it is also need for the sector. Because as I was trying to tell you, with a 23 lakh crore or 25 lakh crores of debt requirement, you can't expect it from the term lending. There's no way. Term lending can max give us 12 lakh crores or 14 lakh crores. Rest has to come from the bond market, whether we like it or not. This is something which is a top priority. I also agree with Labania. There is nothing as green bonds. Bond is bond. Green is just an add tag to it. We have to hold a greenium on this part. What is important is more than the green bond, we need to have an asset-backed bond to be recognized by the Indian market, which has got a longer tenure. Today, bulk of the bond market mimics the corporate bond market. Even if I have an asset, the sweet spot for raising bond is 3 to 5 years. Even if I have a 10-year tenure, there will be no subscription available. And that is something that we need to evolve. And that is where I would say that government also has to play a role to push the insurance companies and the pension companies to start taking certain positioning as a part of their AUM to subscribe to this RE based or a green asset backed bond market, so that you need to populate that. And having said that, if we start looking at the Indian insurance companies getting into this foray, it's also, we'll see that in the global pension will also will get into this business. That's for sure, because it's like walk the talk. If we start it first, the others would likely to follow. As it happened in renewables also in the equity front before, where a lot of domestic equity was got into renewables and then the global equity came in. So we also have to evolve a similar thing for the debt market, where the Indian entities on the insurance and the pension gets into the debt market, particularly bond market, and then you likely see that the global pension funds also get into it. That's what I would like to say.
So thanks for these comments. And maybe in short, you could also add, since the topic of the webinar was your expectations from the budget. So as one of the largest renewable energy developers in India, what do you expect from the budget to come and support the sector? And also because what and also for the 5 years next, because as we know, budget is no longer a single day activity. If, the government keeps on coming up with reforms and notifications out and out. So anything in short, if you can show, yeah.
So one thing which has been pending from the industry side is, as we move ahead, we see a lot of projects will use battery as a storage device. Because plain vanilla solar may not be acceptable to bulk of the utilities, so you need to store electricity in the afternoon and release it in the evening. So a battery becomes an integral part of your project. Interestingly, the BCD rate for a battery for e-vehicles is 5%, while for utilities 18%. It's the same battery, but it depends on what the use is. So one thing that the industry has been saying is, we can at least peg it in line with EV batteries, so that you are able to offer electricity much cheaper than what we can using a storage device. That's one thing, that's a particular thing from the industry. Second ask is something very interesting, Vaibhav. This is true for all infra projects in India. The way the infra projects are created in India, you have to create SPVs, because the concession agreement is within SPV. And you also raise debt on an SPV because the bankers would like a particular ring fencing control in case of security creation. So essentially happens is, in renewables you'll have one particular company having like 150 SPVs depending on the number of projects they carry, while the holdco might be incurring a loss while the SP is making profit. So essentially you have bad tax planning in this entire thing. So suppose if my outflow for tax was like only 300 crores, I would be ending up paying like 800 crores. Because at SP level, the taxation will be there, while the holdco is a loss-making entity, because you'll have carry forward losses on the holdco. So I think as far as tax computation is concerned, it's very important that you should have tax computation at group level, just not for renewables, all infra companies. This is an issue of all infra businesses. And if you do so, then you essentially release money as equity to be infused in your newer projects. So essentially, if one was to look at pushing infra in a big way, be it roads, ports, renewables, anything, you require constant flow of equity. Now there are two options: either you raise equity or you roll back internal equities to newer projects to have a faster pace of execution. This is something that this is true across the world. I mean to say, a lot of countries in the world allow group level taxation. I think this is now we need to also evolve India to a group level taxation. That's something that is obviously may not be done overnight, but this is something one has to look at it. And in terms of tax foregone, it's not much for the entire balance sheet of government of India, but the multiplier it can have in terms of rolling out infra projects is far superior. I think Ms. Tandon also spoke about CBAM. We all know that CBAM is going to be effective from next year, where essentially there will be anybody who's exporting to Europe will be taxed based on their emissions. So, for example, if somebody is producing some product in India having an emission intensity of say 50 kg CO2, they will be taxed accordingly when they enter the European market. The whole idea is the EU says that there is a cost of abatement, and people coming from the developing country have a lower cost of abatement. So we should tax them to have a level playing field. That's what the idea what CBAM is. Well, one thing is we can start putting an export emission tax from India. See, in any case, the product has to pay a tax, either from in Europe or you get taxed in India. The moment you tax an export tax from India on emissions, then they don't have to pay the import tax over there. That level playing field is lost out. And this money, which is getting created in India, can be utilized as a fund to push more and more infra and green infra in India. That is something that we can look at it. And obviously, another thing which is always there is, GST needs to be subsumed in electricity, but that is something which is a very, very politically agile thing, and it's not a budget recommendation also, but something GST is, you don't get a set of, you have a huge amount of input GST available. But then there are a host of other things, in terms of direct taxes. For example, to inculcate more interest in green bonds, why can't be the interest income of the bondholder be tax free? So whenever you get a greenium for the bond, whoever is raising the bond, and also create a little bit of attraction to deepen the nascent green bond market in India. So that is something that I was thinking about. The government should look into it. And another thing which is manufacturing side. See, unlike when you put a solar project, the depreciation rate is 40%. That is allowed by the government of India. While if you set up manufacturing for solar, depreciation is 15% only. And we all know these solar technologies keep on changing every 3 years. So everybody who's setting up manufacturing for solar in India have to upgrade 90% of their plant and machinery in the 4th year. So logically, they should be also allowed a 40% depreciation. It's a mismatch, because don't expect a solar manufacturing entity to run the same plant and machinery for 15 years. It doesn't happen nowhere in the world. Every 3 years, the technology changes. So you need to upgrade almost 90%. So this is something that should be looked at. And if they can reduce 40% depreciation in solar modules, it's okay, because that projects again anyway going to run for 50 years, 25 years. And yes, everybody has this same recommendation of extension of 115 BAB Income Tax Act, because it just creates further more liquidity to create more equity. One thing that we've been talking about, as you also pointed out, that what are the challenges? The challenges in India happens to be execution challenges. So when you execute a project, you will have a lot of local challenges that happens while executing a project. Now, one thing that we've been talking about is if Gati Shakti can also start monitoring project development, because most of these projects like 250 megawatt, 300 megawatt, worth 2,500 crores, and they might be having local challenges, but they never get reported on the Gati Shakti portal. So we thought, why can't we definitely push it on the Gati Shakti? At least they start monitoring those projects. So, can be a faster execution. Again, one of the agenda is also to not increase the risk parameters as RBI has proposed for infra. It just increases the cost of debt. And in terms of, it will increase the cost of electricity also. And yeah, we're talking about exports from India. Everybody's talking about exports from India. Now, as such renewables are concerned, if you were to export, normally you'll export 500 megawatt or a 1 gigawatt worth of either wind turbines or modules. Interestingly, Exim Bank's net worth is only 20,000 crore. So per entity exposure is not more than 3,000 crore, 15% of that, which is something like $400 million, which is very, very low. If India was to export a big way, I think the net worth of the Exim Bank needs to be increased at least more than double. At least they can start offering $1 billion line of credit per entity. Then China Exim gives $5 billion line of credit. US gives $2.5 billion. Germany $2.5 billion. While India Exim Bank is only $400 million. Now, if one was to export a product worth $1 billion, Exim cannot support you, which is supposed to do so. So I think that's another thing that we need to look at. You can institutional strengthening for export purpose also. And finally, one thing that we did discuss with Government of India is the way the climate change is happening in India. You're moving from El Nino to La Nina, and you have a huge amount of changes in weather, both in terms of solar installation as well as wind speeds, directions, and its intensity on the supply side. On the demand side, the demand is also fluctuating. Maybe it's high time we should create a national forecasting portal where essentially people can pull in all the data, their MetMask data, their solar data, put together in one particular model. I am taken to entire modeling. This is something that's very, very important because you have variability of renewables coming in, you have the climate changes happening, and load forecasting. So this is something which is something that should be done. So there's a couple of things. Vaibhav.
So thanks, Chintan. So there are lots and lots of ideas. I guess we can do another webinar just on these ideas and discuss them. And you also solved some of the problems that I was supposed to ask Ms. Tandon, since you talked about exports and all those bits. And also we can ask her for her comments. Are these possible lower GST rates? And because she is a tax professor, if you she is a professor of taxation and all those bits. So maybe if possible, you can just touch upon not possible in your comments. But with these thoughts and lots of solution to digest, I will move on to Miss Agarwal over here and ask her. So Chintan said, "ये industry मांगे बहुत more and lower tax, better tax structures, and a host of other solutions he suggested, monitoring, better monitoring, and all of these. So for you, what are the things that could stimulate the growth in the EV as a sector? What kind of government intervention you already touched upon that you require FAME 3 and other bits, but still, what could be the demand from an EV or an automobile sector to keep growing, just not at 7% of GDP or maybe even higher? And if exports are to be seen, which is constantly going down in terms of numbers of vehicles that are being exported, the growth is not as high as it used to be earlier in 2000, even though at a lower base. So what for you could be your as a credit rating agency looking into the sector that could make EV players not bleed money, but make money and expand, as we talked about the scalability and other parameters?
Right, see, the basic thing which government will have to focus on if we really want to see the exports to pick up, as you mentioned, and if we really want the EV to penetrate more, is we'll have to work towards reducing the EV prices, make them more affordable. And for this, what I feel is the localization of batteries would be crucial. And in this regard, further support in the form of PLI scheme for advanced cell chemistry shall be beneficial for the sector. And another concern which we see, which goes in the minds of the consumer, is range anxiety. So a lot of support will have to go towards building up the charging infrastructure that needs to improve substantially. And we expect the government support in this regard in the upcoming budget. And besides, we see government have also been kind of making policy towards bringing global EV players to manufacture in India, which will kind of increase the competitiveness in the industry, and probably this will also work towards reducing the EV prices as we move forward in long term. So these are few things I feel is required in the EV industry.
All the EV hosts who are listening to her, the way to higher credit rating has been laid out. आपको कैसे rating ज़्यादा मिलेगी? So these are the recommendations that you may need to pitch to the government, I guess. And now I can turn back to Ms. Tandon over here. So we talked about exports, a lot of things that are being laid out. Somebody also asked a question around FRBM and all those bits. So where is the money for making sure that all the exports? So Chintan came up with an idea that we can levy a tax at our own borders and then fund it for building up infra. Can something similar be done for exports? How we can just make sure that we are competitive enough, where schemes like IRA are coming up with a $3 incentive for per hydrogen kg of hydrogen for next 10 years, while in India the incentives are far lower. Many projects are coming up in Middle East and all those bits. So how India could be competitive in the new world where the energy systems are moving towards more and more renewable and I would say Akshay Urja based systems. So over to you.
Thanks, Vaibhav. I indeed believe Mr. Shah had a long list of things or suggestions to sort of remedy some of the issues that we are seeing in this space. But also going back to the concerns that were raised in the question on the FRBM limits. So, if we look at the vision of the government, it is quite clear that there's going to be fiscal consolidation over the next few years. So, what we will have to be mindful of is that some of the budgetary heads that are being allocated to certain priority sectors would perhaps be rejigged or moved around more than saying that there would be tremendous additionality. So I guess there is a need to draw out that priority listing, even in terms of tax structure. So, for example, Mr. Shah mentioned the new tax regime, which is available to some of the new ventures. I guess that's what he was referring to, the lower tax rate. So, what we've seen even in terms of tax policy over the last 5 to 6 years is there's been a cleaning up of the system. There's a push towards the new regime where incentives are lower, as well as the rates are sort of rationalized, at least for the continuing businesses at 25%. I would imagine that the shift from that regime back to lower rates might be slightly difficult to argue with or to sort of ask for. What I do think is possible is that there could be some kind of a tax credit mechanism which is also compatible with the global shift of applicability of minimum taxes, which is being proposed for large countries. And IRA is that these tax credits can be compatible with the minimum tax proposals. So India could perhaps think of those. And I think once there are these incentives which are built in, they sort of help push towards renewables, they help push towards EV adoption. They in itself get inbuilt into the production processes, which in a sense could help comply to in part with what the border adjustment taxes require to do. I think one which is outside the scope of the budget purely is the introduction to carbon markets, which has been talked about quite frequently. We still have to see the nuts and bolts of that, but can help talk to countries like the EU about what our pricing strategy is. But just going back to the fact that you can use the current budgets more sensibly, one in the form of revenue foregone on account of tax incentives which are designed specifically for, let's say, renewables which exist in some ways today, but perhaps maybe like a slightly expanded scope. And the other is, of course, a more broad-based strategy for some of these sectors. Thank you.
Thanks, so Anjali. So very important points around how we can make sure that India stays competitive in the export market and how we can make sure that the money is there for exporters to be so available to them to make sure that they are competitive enough. And if panelists allow me to extend the session by 5 minutes, uh, we can extend it by 5 minutes because uh, I guess we were quite active in the participation over here. So over to Mr. Jana over here. So you talked about a lot of reforms that would be required in and around, and there are questions around as well. What could be the role of refinancing? And we Chintan talked about how the bond markets are important. But the debate around that's going around out there is how the technology can be incorporated into this. Can the government directives help into bringing more finance out there to the people, or how to make sure that the distribution of money is possible to unbanked, or I would say channels where the actual credit gap still exists? So what in your viewpoint could be the role of technology to make sure that the credit gap is, we can bridge it, and how we can bridge it. Any thoughts around those lines would be really helpful.
I know technology will definitely help in reducing cost of transaction or cost of due diligence, which is important for any lender or investors. For example, if any lender or investors can come to know, okay, the company is not doing well, they can take appropriate actions. Because in my experience, one of the NBFCs in which we were engaged, we found out that that particular NBFC they installed a system in the borrower place, and the system will tell you every minute, actually every day, what is the energy consumption of that borrower, because the energy consumption reflect the performance of a company. Okay, it means that the lender and investor has a first-hand information, okay, about the company. So in the case of renewable energy or any energy transition I'm talking about in the industrial sector, if the technology can be installed and first-hand information can go to lender and investors, definitely the investors can make sure, okay, my money is in the right place and they can take appropriate measures. That one. Second is that can we use technology in reducing transaction cost or due diligence cost, or can we use technologies in connecting investors as well as borrower or investing companies or borrowers? Is that possible? There is a lot of number of platform actually created historically, which we call, let's say, matchmaking platform designed by CDP a couple of years back. The idea is that there are certain number of investees or borrowers who need money. Okay, they don't know how to access this money at a reasonable rate. Okay, but there are certain set of investors who are looking for investment opportunity, not at a very large scale, but maybe at a very small scale. Is it possible that by using those peer-to-peer lending platform or investor platform, can we connect borrowers and investors there? Technology play a significant role. Another component I would like to hear is climate change risk. Actually, is very critical, because most of the lenders and investors, they're really struggling to incorporate climate change risk in their lending and investing decision, which is not good for the renewable energy companies or clean transportation company, because they are at the same level of risk than compared to conventional companies. But once the lenders and investors can, if they can use technology, for example, physical risk of climate change or the transition risk of climate change, by using technologies, if they can integrate that in their investment and lending decision making process, is definitely going to help in energy transition. For example, nowadays there are technology companies which are using satellite. Actually, those satellite mapping is helping them to quantify the carbon emission or GHG emission of facilities, of manufacturing facilities. It means that if you are a bondholder or a lender, you can understand that the quantum of carbon emission generated from a particular manufacturing facility. Okay, you can definitely see that what is the transition risk associated with that particular investment. With that measure, investors can really quantify transition risk or physical risk, and they can reorient their capital flows from highly carbon intensive business to low carbon intensive business. Then I would like to highlight here, I mean, pension fund and insurance company, historically, they helped in investing in infrastructure sector and social sector. For example, pension funds, insurance companies, they're bound to invest in social and infrastructure sector, I think 15% or so. So there is a possibility that the government may announce tomorrow, okay, 5% of money should go to green sector, for example. It means that massive inflow of capital for the renewable energy sector or clean transportation. There is a possibility in the future, because it could be a very significant, not only for climate change reason, but also for strategic reason as well, because India wants to be a global exporter or manufacturer. So when you are talking about global exporter, it means that you must be really competitive from carbon intensity point of view. So here the government has a role as a policymaker to intervene and ask regulator, okay, is it possible? But at the same time, I can understand that, okay, you cannot ask these companies to invest in low quality assets. Okay, there is definitely a risk which you need to take needs to be taken care, because some of the banks actually in developed countries, they are also thinking about there is too much of capital flows is going to the renewable energy sector, and it is going very, very quickly. Okay, if the money is flowing very, very quickly, the quality of the assets become a question mark. It happened to the telecommunication industries in the 1990s. It happened to the housing sector in the end of 1990s and in the beginning of 2000. So we must be very, very careful about that as well.
I guess
Here I
in the new
wanted to
walls.
add just one point that as we all are discussing on more funds to be available for the industry. So I feel impact funds are also required, who would bring in lot of funds, and government and regulators are pretty aware about that, and that's why they are working a lot on ESG front. SEBI have also recently given licenses to all rating agencies on ESG risk rating. So probably the idea as of now, yes, ESG rating is recommendatory, but idea is kind of to attract more funds from global markets with this ESG rating, which would give confidence to these impact funds. So this is one more area wherein kind of regulator is working on.
Thanks, Ms. Agarwal. So over to you, Chintan, but only a minute for your intervention. We
Yeah,
are
yeah.
already 8 minutes over. Please.
Definitely. Vaibhav, I think what we missed out today in the entire discussion is financial inclusion and the credit gaps which is needed for the mid-sized players, which I think partly got missed out today. I think you would have a separate webinar on practically on this, because this entire MSME sector, which essentially needs to be a part of the energy transition journey. And they're not able to get into it because of lack of credit availability at the right places. That's all.
Yeah, so I guess you and Labanya sort of answered the last three questions that were there. Where is the money for the small and medium players? How it needs to be channeled out there, and how to make sure that we can have money where it is needed. So I guess we are already 8 minutes over time. In case you have any last comments, please add, or maybe please add. Otherwise, I can hand it back to Nusrat to just conclude the session and summarize it. Because I guess it will be difficult to take the questions now. Even participants are dropping off. So anybody wants to come in? I guess आज का हो गया सबका. So over to you, Nusrat. We are ready to go.
All right. So thank you, Vaibhav. We appreciate the valuable insight shared by our panelists and the engaging discussion led by you. We would also like to extend our gratitude to our audience for participating and contributing to the conversation. Though we are not able to take up the questions, but we would definitely like to consolidate and answer as many as possible, maybe later on email. And we would also like to share the link to the recording as well later on. So thank you everyone for coming in. Your engagement was crucial, and we would like to continue engaging with all the stakeholders and to bring out these innovative solutions, the challenges and the recommendations from the industry side, from the experts, and bring everyone to the one table and to make things happen for a Viksit Bharat for 2047. So we are all in this mission together. So thank you, everyone.